Hey there, it's Jackie from 40 Thrive. Before we get started, I want to share something pretty exciting. If you heard our last episode, we announced an upcoming workshop with therapist Melody Murray. It's called Who Are You? We dive into our family of origin, which will help us begin to understand how we are, who we are. In this impactful and empowering workshop, you will get the tools to help the real you bust through and come out on the other side of reinvention. For more info, check out the show notes at 40thrive.com/episode 92. I would love to see you there.
You're listening to the 40 Thrive Podcast, the show created for women 40 and beyond, ready to shake things up. And now, your host, Jackie McDougall.
Welcome to another episode of 40 Thrive. If you're anything like me and millions of other women in midlife, you may hold on pretty firmly to your memories and the impact that they may have on your actions even today, even if those memories are from decades ago. How many times have you thought, oh, I'm not going to do that, because you remember at a time in your 20s when you did something similar and it didn't go so well? Or maybe you don't even care for a person or place or situation because you remember it wasn't your cup of tea 3 years ago. What if I told you those memories that you feel so certain about might actually be wrong? And if you're sitting there like, you don't know what you're talking about, Jackie, because I'm certain I know what happened. I'm telling you right now, you still might be wrong. Dr. Ginger Campbell is the author of Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. And she's the host of the highly respected podcast Brain Science, which began airing back in 2006. Yes, she was one of the originals. She has a passion for making complex ideas feel so accessible, and she helps scientists share their ideas with people of all backgrounds. Plus, she has a second podcast called Graying Rainbows, where she explores the, quote, messy middle of coming out later in life. We're going to get into that as well. So sit back, grab a cup of whatever you like, and join us for this eye-opening conversation. Real quick, before we do that, did you know that you can become a member of our 40 Thrive Insiders Club? All right, that's not the official name for it because we don't have one yet, but for a few bucks a month, literally, you can attend a live podcast episode every month, and you get to attend a little 40 Thrive happy hour, get to know other like-minded women, get support, exchange ideas, all of those things. So check out 40thrive.com/episode 92 for more information. I would love to have you part of this really special opportunity. Okay, that's it from me. Let's hear from Dr. Ginger Campbell. Dr. Campbell, welcome to 40 Thrive.
Well, thanks for having me. Please call me Ginger.
Ginger, thank you so much for doing this. So when I think about podcasting, as a podcaster, and I love to listen to podcasts, I've been podcasting since 2009. It looks like I was late for the game. You started in 2006.
Yeah, and I was not a beginner. I mean, podcasting actually started in 2004. A lot of people don't realize that, but yeah.
Yeah. And so you've been doing Brain Science since then. You also have Graying Rainbows, which we're going to get into today. I love the intersection of what you know, what your expertise is, and who you are and what your personal story is. And you have one podcast for each of those. It's great.
Yeah.
So which came first? Because I know your book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty, which I discussed a little bit in the bio before you got here. Which came first, the book idea or Brain Science?
Brain Science. The book is actually based on episode 42, 43, and 96.
And how did that evolve from episodes into this book?
Another pioneering podcaster, Evo Terra, he wanted to do a course on how to do ebooks. This was when Amazon was first starting the KDP platform. And so I was like a beta tester for his course, and I didn't have time to write a full book at the time. So I asked myself, well, what episodes would make a good book? And that's how the first edition of Are You Sure? Came about, based on 42 and 43 with Robert Burton. And the reason I picked that material was because I thought that it was really important ideas that could stand alone. A person didn't need a lot of other background.
Right.
And then when I decided I wanted to expand that into a paperback that people could actually buy more than just an ebook, I decided to add his follow-up interview that was episode 96.
And that was the second edition.
That's in the second edition, yes.
Those are 2 episodes of the hundreds of episodes that you've done.
Right.
And I think there are a lot of people out there, especially my audience, where a lot of them are looking to write a book or do something big that you didn't let it stop you. You just move forward. But I guess you haven't really let anything stop you in your life, it seems.
Well, I don't think I'm going to go there, but yeah, I mean, my problem really is that I have so much material. I could write, more books.
Yeah.
A lot of people want to write a book so that they can get some credibility in their field.
You don't need that.
Right. And that's not really an issue for me. So I don't get that out of doing a book. My real reason for writing the book was to try to reach people who don't listen to podcasts.
To attract them to this book and then continue to listen to the podcast after that.
Right.
Yeah. So brain science, I will tell you right now, I learned so much and I feel so dumb all at the same time.
It's supposed to make you feel smart.
Yes, but neuroscience is a little bit above my expertise, you can imagine. But I'm fascinated with how our brains work and how we think our brains work. And the difference between those 2 things, right?
Right.
So I want to talk about your book. Are you sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. I have memories in my life, and I see this all the time when I'm working with women. Sometimes we have a story that we're holding on to, and it's actually part of the fiber of our existence. And it's because we remember things in this very specific way. And based on what I have read so far, you're saying that that's a little bit BS.
Well, what we've learned about memory is that it's highly unreliable. And the reason is that it's not like a videotape like we imagine. Every time you recall a memory, your brain basically reconstructs that memory. And what happens is you add in new stuff that's happened in between, things you've heard from other people, and it all gets merged into the new version of that memory. And Elizabeth Loftus has shown, and she did this back in the early 90s, how really easy it actually is to install false memories into people. So with all that in mind, you just have to realize that our memories are pretty unreliable. It doesn't have to mean that we don't take them into account, but my biggest thing is don't get into a fight with somebody because they remember an event one way and you another. I mean, I have a sister who's a year younger than me, and sometimes I think we had entirely separate childhoods, right? And it's amazing the differences between our memories.
Right.
The example that I usually think of, because I was a small child when President Kennedy was assassinated, and I remember spending the weekend watching television, and I have this strong memory of seeing Jack Ruby shoot Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, this happened on live TV. But the thing is, after I read Dr. Burton's work, I realized I might not have actually seen it. I might have just seen a replay and then merged together the fact that I know that it was recorded live. Just to give you an example of how you can have something that you're sure you did that might not be true. And another thing is the emotional impact of the memory is not a guarantee of its accuracy. That's another myth. People think, well, this happened. It was so powerful. I know it's correct. And unfortunately, that's not reliable either. It's true you're more likely to remember things that have emotional impact, but that doesn't mean that your long-term memory of that is going to be more accurate.
Right. Why do you think that our memory of that event isn't accurate?
Because it's subject to the same adaptations and changes over time. For example, the Challenger disaster, where a scientist actually interviewed people right afterwards and had them write down what they were doing, what they were feeling, etc. And then a couple years later, he talked to them, and only about 25% of them had memories that really matched what they had originally written down. And there was even this guy who looked at his own handwriting and said, I know that's what I wrote, but what I remember now is what happened.
That's interesting.
One of the striking importances of this is it means that eyewitness testimony may not be as reliable as we think. And I kind of think, based on what I know now, that what they ought to do when something happens is interview everybody right away, record it, and then never talk to them again. Because as soon as they start talking to each other, their stories change.
Right.
And that's not because they're bad. It's just that's the way memory works.
Right. So let's go back to that guy you mentioned who saw his own handwriting. He knows that he wrote it, and it was closer to the event that actually happened. Why are we so committed to owning the memory years later when we know for a fact that that's not what we remembered at the time?
Okay, so that gets back to the original theme of the book, which is about certainty, which is the feeling that you know something.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't happen at a conscious level. It happens unconsciously. And one of the things that contributes to that is a feeling of familiarity. We know that brain processing is faster when something's familiar. I mean, that's one reason why if somebody tells you the same lie over and over again, people start to believe it because it feels familiar, and feeling familiar leads to rapid processing, which leads to the brain's conclusion that went fast, it must be the right answer.
Interesting.
When somebody tells you that it's something else, your natural response is to say, no, this is what happened. Mm-hmm. And if we didn't have that sort of feeling that we knew what we were doing, we'd all be frozen by paralysis. So you can understand why it's a survival thing to have this, you might say, cognitive flaw. Unfortunately, it also can lead us to make mistakes.
Right.
And I think the worst thing that I talk about in the book is I think it just leads to intolerance. If we are so sure we're always right and so sure everybody else is wrong, we don't listen to each other. We don't consider the possibility that there are other ways of looking at things.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I think when we have someone of authority, even if it's our parents, who have certain beliefs, we believe those things because we've heard it repeat, like you were talking about, repeatedly, and they have so much conviction until we start to question it. What do you say to those people who grew up believing one thing and now they're starting to question it or starting to realize that the beliefs that they have aren't necessarily serving who they are today?
Well, I'll give you an example. When I was a young adult, I was a Jehovah's Witness. You couldn't get farther away from where I am now than when I was like 22 years old. And I used to literally go door to door and knock on people's doors. And I would say to them, you shouldn't be afraid of examining what you believe, because if it's true, you're just going to show yourself that it's true. After a few years, I actually ended up having to apply that same rule to my own beliefs, which led to my leaving Jehovah's Witnesses. Sometimes we have to change our beliefs. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Often it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But it's sort of a matter of integrity if you think that the facts matter.
Right. I find that I'm more curious now. I think it's really important in midlife and beyond to come from a place of curiosity. I think the older I get, the more I realize I know absolutely nothing.
Oh yeah, you never know more than you knew when you were 17.
Right? And my parents were so stupid.
Yeah.
I don't know how they got smarter as I got older, but they did. They're miraculous like that.
Yeah.
What kind of reaction have you gotten to the book? Are you getting a lot of personal stories? Are you like breaking people's minds open, or what's happening?
Well, most of the emails I get these days come from people that are listening to Graying Rainbows, because that seems to be striking a huge need.
Right. So let's talk about Graying Rainbows. I mean, first of all, 60 years old, you came out as gay. You had been in a marriage with a man for how many years?
38.
38 years. And he had passed away 6 months before you came out. What was the journey for you?
So as a young person growing up in the early 70s, I heard almost nothing at all about homosexuality. I can remember when I was a sophomore in high school playing basketball, having somebody say that the coach and some players on their team were queer, which was a derogatory term at the time.
Right.
And my reaction was, what are you scared about? They can't get you pregnant. I figured we should be worrying about getting raped, not worrying about whether another woman was a lesbian. But,
right.
That was my logic. But I got married really young, so I didn't really think about it. And then as I was getting ready to start medical school, I think I was 24, and I'd been married for about 3 years. I had a brief affair with a woman. And so that started me down the questioning pathway. I realized there were other choices. This was 1980, and my husband was my best friend. It was not a good time to be gay at all. And I just decided, well, if it's not worth it, I'll just stick where I am.
Right.
And then around 95 or so, we went through a rough patch like long-term marriages often do. And at that time, I told him about the affair, but we decided to stay together. I was like, I'm not going to leave this good relationship for the possibility of something else.
Right.
But from that time on, I pretty much considered myself to be bisexual.
Mm.
Now, I have to say he didn't really take it seriously. I mean, he was always like, well, you could learn to enjoy sex, which I have to admit I never did. But he was 9 years older than me, so I knew that I would outlive him, but I always figured, I'd be like 70 when he died, and I was 59 when he died.
Right.
And so I'd always figured when he died, I would just stay single. But after the shock wore off, I realized, no, I don't want to spend the rest of my life alone. And no, I have no interest in spending it with another man. I must be a lesbian. There you are. I guess maybe I've had one date. Of course, with COVID, there's no...
Right. If you're single, like that, COVID will kill it, right?
Yeah. I have my golden retriever, so that's a good thing. Otherwise, I'd be super lonely.
Yeah.
I've talked to so many women who even realized that they were gay without ever even having a relationship with a woman, because it's really not about sex.
Right.
Especially as we get older. My show has male and female listeners and trans listeners. I make an effort to equal the guests, and even to try to alternate them. Mm-hmm. So I get a lot of emails from guys too. And they say the same thing. As a woman, I have this preconceived notion that men are so sexual that they would have known and they would have.
Right.
But no, some same things can happen to them, and they can make that same realization without even having any kind of sexual relationship.
Right.
Sex is only part of it. It's really about intimacy. And why do I feel that way and another person doesn't? There is evidence that it's biological. Mm-hmm. But the evidence that we have right now, I think, is being overly extrapolated to explain everything, right?
Right.
I doubt that it's as simple as people want it to be, because nothing ever is. But the goal of Graying Rainbows is for people to feel less alone. And that's the reason why I've gone to mostly interviewing people that are just sharing their stories.
Right.
And I'll get an email after every episode. That story hit me. I identify with that. I don't feel so alone.
So you're with your husband for all these years. You obviously questioned, you come out. What was the reaction from family, friends? Were they supportive?
Oh, you finally figured it out?
Like they've known for years, basically?
Yeah, we knew you'd figure it out eventually.
Right. It's very difficult for a lot of people, obviously, at any age to come out. But how do you go from realizing this, telling your friends and family, to then going public with a podcast such as Graying Rainbows?
I actually thought of the idea of Graying Rainbows in 2016. I came out in 2015. Mm-hmm. You know what happened in 2016. So I sort of chickened out for a couple of years. And then I decided, well, if I'm not going to speak up now, when am I going to speak up? It was my small voice of protest. Of course, I consider Brain Science its own protest since it's a pro-science show.
So both of your podcasts are a little bit of a protest. So given that I don't know, is it more difficult as you get older to come out?
I don't know if it's more difficult. I think it's just different. The challenges are different. And that's the reason why I started Graying Rainbows, which is for coming out LGBT plus later in life, because I think the challenges are different. When you're a young person, it's part of figuring out who you are. When you're older, you hopefully know who you are, at least to a certain extent. You have a certain identity and you have a place in your community and you have a family. You may have a spouse. You may have kids. The spouse and kids are a big part of the puzzle for most people. That doesn't exist for a young person coming out. Now, for a young person coming out, it's telling their parents, talking to their siblings, but there's different issues. Especially for women, their concerns about guilt toward their children are big. That's a big, big challenge.
Yeah.
And for them to come to realize that the thing that the children usually struggle with is the divorce, not the whether their mother's gay. And I was amazed by how many of them didn't seem to realize they were in bad marriages. Their marriage was bad, separate from whether or not they were gay. And on the other hand, now I've talked to quite a few people who are in good marriages. but they're gay. And that's an entirely different challenge.
Right.
So I don't think it's harder. I think it's just different.
Yeah. And so if someone were listening now and really considering this, and maybe they are in a good marriage. I mean, you're a prime example. Your husband was your best friend. You were in this marriage for many, many years. Do you think that you would have come out had he not passed?
Not publicly, but that would have been for him. I didn't feel the need to, but that's me. There's a great book that's been out since the 90s and just recently had its third edition, which is called Married Women Who Love Women by Karen Strock. You can get her book off of Amazon. You know, that's the issue. One issue is there's so little information out there for us.
Right.
But the thing that's interesting about Karen is she's still with her husband. She's in a very unusual situation where she lives with her female partner and her husband. Now, most of us are not going to be able to pull that off.
Right.
So I'm not suggesting that that is a common solution, but it brings out the point that there's no one size fits all.
Right.
Another thing is that sometimes people forget what it's like to be on the other side. I interviewed this woman that's with this organization called the Straight Spouses Network. And if someone is going and listening to Graying Rainbows, I highly encourage them to listen to that episode because she brings out what it's like to be on the other side. So if you are thinking about coming out, it might be helpful to listen and think about, you know, how is this going to impact the other person? One of the points that she and several other guests made is, you know, if you come out and you've been struggling with it for 10 years, you may feel like your family members should just go, oh, yeah, great. But they may be totally blindsided.
Right.
And they have to have room for their emotions. And I've talked to so many people that over time, their relationships change. If they leave room, you know, they don't cut the person off. Also, it'll be the person they think is going to be okay has a problem. And the person they expect to have a problem is okay.
Right.
So trying to predict how people are going to react, you're going to be surprised.
Yeah, I think that goes for any big life change.
Yeah, probably so.
It's not necessarily about your sexuality. A lot of people do not want that story to change. And if you change it, they're going to be very uncomfortable with it. So as far as having someone you love come out, what would be the best way to support someone?
Well, tell them that you love them and be honest. You know, say, I'm struggling. Please give me some time. I still love you. The most important thing is to say, I still love you, even though I'm struggling. And if you're not okay, I'm not really okay with this, but it doesn't mean that I don't love you.
I think that's so important because we have such power in giving people permission to be themselves, whether they're coming out or they're telling you something else that maybe that they haven't been honest with, or they haven't even understood themselves. And so really just letting someone know that you love them when they're going through it is powerful. Thank you for that reminder.
Yep.
So we've got Brain Science. We've got this book. I'm going to link to the book in the show notes. You got to go and get it. I'm not a neuroscientist, but at the same time, I'm super fascinated with the brain. I'm super fascinated with why do I tell myself these stories? Why do I believe these things? I mean, my husband and I are celebrating our 18th anniversary today, and we're talking about memories like as you do. And we both don't necessarily remember things exactly the same way. We had two very different experiences, whether it was at the kids or even at our own wedding. It was a completely different experience. And so this book has opened my mind that I don't know it all. And it's okay that our brains are meant to make us believe that we know it all. I think it's a really powerful book, even for the layperson like myself. Where do you see Brain Science and Graying Rainbows? Like, what's in the future? What should we expect?
Well, I think that eventually I'll have enough stories that it'll make sense to put that into some kind of anthology.
Yeah.
To be honest, I think my gift really is talking to other scientists and helping them to share what they do.
Yeah.
I really enjoy talking to scientists and making their work accessible to other people.
And I like how you do that because I can't imagine having a conversation about the work that they do. You have a gift for making it accessible, that it's not just sort of this inside baseball talk that your average person can't understand. That's what I like about it.
Yeah, and that is my goal. Making a show for that diverse an audience is very challenging and never boring.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to the next 500 episodes.
Are you going to go to the She Podcast event next October? That's what I'm looking forward to.
Yes, I will be there for sure. I love supporting them, anything that they do. Elsie and Jess are amazing. So yes, I'll be there.
I'm looking forward to being able to travel and see people in person without masks again someday.
I know it seems so far away, but nothing lasts forever. We'll get there. We'll get back to travel. So
yeah.
Ginger, thank you so much for doing this. I love your work.
Thank you, Jackie.
And I really appreciate your coming on.
Thanks again.
Thank you so much for listening. It has been possible to do this show for 2 years because of 2 things. Number 1, you subscribe. Thank you. When you subscribe to the podcast, you never have to search for it again. You will get every episode. You'll get an alert. You can choose your favorite podcast app. It can be on your iPhone. It can be on your Android. It can be on your tablet. It can be on your home speaker. There are so many places you can subscribe to 40 Thrive so you can get it automatically. So thanks for doing that. I really appreciate it. And number 2, I hope you'll consider sharing this podcast, because when you share it, not only does it help us be able to continue this and to reach more people, but imagine what it would be like if all of the women in the world over 40 felt their best and were able to stand up and take charge and support each other, right? Imagine it. And so when you share the show, we are one step closer to that. So I really appreciate it. Until next time, take care and keep thriving. Spring has sprung, and with the change of seasons, sometimes comes an increase in vitality. If you're feeling in the mood for a little more personal time, may I suggest Coconu. Coconu is all about providing clean and natural ingredients when you're enjoying your most intimate moments, with or without a partner. Naturally safe products developed by people who are obsessed with quality. Get 15% off with promo code GROWNASS at grownasswoman.guide/Coconu. That's 15% off with promo code GROWNASS at grownasswoman.guide/Coconu.